This is the technical session, the second technical session, understanding how social norms and legal frameworks impact women and children's registration of vital events and CRVS systems. And the moderator is Irina Dincu, who is the Senior Program Specialist at the Center of Excellence for Civil Registration Vital Statistics Systems here at IDRC. And it's a pleasure to have her as a colleague in our team. So please, Irina, go ahead.
Well, is it working? Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really privileged to be here with such, distinguished guests. Some of them I have the privilege to call my friends. This is, I hope, a very interesting panel, and I hope it's going to be thought-provoking for some of you. I have here I'm going to start from here, maybe just close on my left, Sandile Simelane. He's the technical specialist on CRVS at the UNFPA headquarters in New York. Sandile is a demographer by training. He has worked more than 15 years with Statistics South Africa before joining the team in New York. Then I have Doghi. Doghi works with the Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Poland as OSCE. And he is the chief contact point for Roma and Sinti issues. He's a social scientist by training, trained in Cluj-Napoca, Romania, and he's working on Roma issues for more than 20 years. He has started back in late 90s, both at country and global level. Sitting close to them, we have Claire Brolan. Claire Brolan originally trained in international law and human rights, and then she has a PhD in public health, and her postdoctoral studies are at the University of Toronto, and they focused on SDGs and CRVS rights to health nexus. And currently, I think that Claire works on something very interesting, which is gender and CRVS in the Asia and Pacific region, and she's going to tell us a little bit more in a couple of minutes. Leyla Sharafi. Leyla is a gender advisor, again with our friends and colleagues from UNFPA in the headquarters. She works on a very interesting project, which is a joint UNICEF and UNFPA program on ending female genital mutilation. She brings together more than 15 years international work experience with the United Nations and also the civil society. And she coordinates UNFPA efforts on gender mainstreaming, and she manages the global gender and human rights programs in relation to most excluded women and girls. And last but not least, we have Niamba. Niamba was actually one of our Ds until just a couple of weeks ago here at IDRC, and he has worked actually on sex differentials in Burkina Faso. He's going to tell us a little bit about his research. He is a demographer again, so I'm sitting with a lot of demographers on my panel. So I hope it's going to be a lot of data coming in. And Louis is actually a researcher at the National Institute of Statistics and Demography of Burkina Faso. And that's it. That's about it. Coming a little bit I'd like to set the stage a little bit for this panel, because this is something which we are not talking about into the field of CRVS. There is a lot of experience in the field of public health, in particular, to some extent in protection about social norms and cultural barriers to registration, right? So we've been privileged enough for the last 20 years to witness the work globally around birth registration with our colleagues from UNICEF, our seniors sitting there, starting all these birth registration campaigns in late 90s with Plan International. And then for the last couple of years, we are seeing a lot of investment in civil registration and vital statistics. So what has really happened? Did coverage really significantly improve on civil registration, on death registration in particular? We're seeing a lot of big numbers in terms of birth registration. So we say that 73% of the children of the population is registered, and of course some do not have the proof. But we can't say the same around death registration. And practically today, we don't really know where we stand in terms of marriage registration. And so one of the questions for the panel and also for the audience is that, is really the investments what we are doing right? Is investing in supply the right thing and the only thing to do? How do we manage working with the communities? How do we partner with the communities so that the citizens, the simple people, the 1/3 of the world who never left their homes and they're planned to live there for the next many years, how do we convince them to trust these public services, to go towards the services, to register these vital events, which actually are regulated by social norms at community level? So how we are translating all this community participation in social events, the social norms around the births, the marriages, and the deaths into improved coverage in vital statistics and civil registration. And I'm not hoping to have an answer. I just want to say that we did a literature review last year, and I'm not going to make you look on the internet. We did it for you, and we found out that there is limited evidence around the social norms and the barriers that impact birth registration. But when we come to marriage registration, there is limited ethnographic evidence, but zero related to civil registration, and for the death that there is nothing. So with having this as a background, just I'm going to allow some of the speakers to actually do a couple of presentations, and then we'll have the opportunity to exchange with them a little bit broader. So we are going to start with our colleague Sandile. Sandile is going to do a presentation around marriage registration and an analysis which he and his team have done around the census data.
Thank you, Irina, and thank you, colleagues. It's my honor and privilege to be here to present the work that we have done collectively at HQ level in UNFPA and regional and country offices. I'm going to talk about marriage registration levels and briefly about differentials in selected countries. The presentation itself, it's brief. It will touch on 3 elements. One is why does marriage and divorce matter? And secondly, what do we know about the levels of coverage of marriage registration and divorce registration? And briefly outline ongoing activities on how UNFPA is engaging on these matters. So why does marriage registration matter? This issue has been touched on since morning, so I won't belabor it much here. Suffice to say that marriage registration, basically, marriage and divorce registration is a tool that can be used to advance social protection and rights of women and their children. And by extension, it can be looked at as a tool that can also be used to advance the gender equality agenda broadly. Now, statistics on marriage registration and divorce registration, when taken and analyzed, it provides useful information about the patterns of family formation as well as dissolution, and that information can be used to inform policies and programming around family welfare. Now, what do we know about marriage registration? The short and straight answer, and Irina touched on it in the introduction, is there is very little evidence. Basically, we know very little about the connection between lack of registration of marriages and divorces and vulnerabilities. So even though we say marriage registration has these benefits, especially for gender equality, it kind of boils down to being a cliche or an anecdote, because we don't have really hardcore evidence to say when you look at this context, women who do not, or this particular segment of the population that does not have registration of these events, suffers these vulnerabilities. So you can go to any, to the websites of national statistics offices. Very few of them are publishing information about marriage registration coverage. You go to the annual demography yearbook, there is information about birth and death registration, but nothing about marriage and divorce registration coverages. So really, that's the big problem. And as part of digging up of the information at UNFPA, we reviewed census questionnaires from the 2010 round of censuses, over 100 questionnaires from, I think 160 to be exact. And we found only 7 countries included some information, direct questions about marriage registration. And these countries are Poland in 2013, Georgia in 2014, Kyrgyzstan in 2009, Armenia 2011, Senegal in 2013, Sri Lanka in 2011, and Australia in 2011. I also have a slide, I don't know whether I can see. Oh yeah, I also have in the slide Congo-Brazzaville. It presents a different case in that they didn't have a direct question on marriage registration, but based on the knowledge of existing national laws and types of marriages that are practiced in the country, you can be able to indirectly infer some information about marriage registration in the country. Lastly, out of the 7 countries that included direct questions on marriage registration, Armenia also included information about divorce registration. So now at UNFPA, to address this knowledge gap or data gap that I mentioned, we are leveraging our direct technical support to censuses and household surveys to kind of build the required databases that can be used to understand, to answer some of the pertinent questions that some have already been thrown up in this forum. Questions like whose marriages and divorces are not registered and why? And question like, does marriage registration really make a difference in the long-term economic and social well-being of women and their children? So we are hoping that by building these databases, we will be able to answer such questions and more. Now, the 7 countries that I mentioned having collected information on marriage registration used different approaches in doing so. The difference mainly can be picked in the reference population to which the questions were asked and in the manner in which they were asked. The reference population ranges from 10 years and above in Senegal to 15 years and above in the other countries, and all members of the population in Australia, and I think Poland will get to that shortly. And then also the other glaring difference is how the information about marriage registration was collected. I'm sure we all know that basically the census has a standard question on current marital status, where you collect information about whether a person has never ever been married, never married, divorced, separated, and so forth, depending on context. So these different countries worked around the category married, the status married. In Armenia, for example, to collect information about, to estimate the coverage of marriage registration, they disaggregated the category married into married, registered, married, not registered. The same in Kyrgyzstan, The same in Poland, but in Poland they also added a more direct question to say, is this particular union or marriage registered with the civil registration authority? And then in Sri Lanka, they did the same, disaggregated the category married into married, but they separate between married civil and married customary. So by default, it looks customary marriages are not registrable in the country. So you can estimate information using that question. And then Australia, the questionnaire had an instruction to interviewers and the respondents that only marriages that are registered. So because a person can only report being married if the marriage is registered. Georgia had a question, a direct question that asks, is a marriage registered? Senegal categorized between monogamous and polygamous marriages, and then added another question on whether is it directly registered. I mentioned Congo being a special case. It represents one case whereby there is no direct question on marriage registration in the census questionnaire, but based on the knowledge of the types of marriages that are practiced in the population and what the current national law recognizes as registrable, we were able to come up with an estimate of what's the coverage of marriage registration. In particular, it's important to highlight that in Congo as well, customary marriages are not registrable. So, summary of the results, we see the data that we have been able to compile so far. 4 countries, marriage coverage levels range from a low of 13% in Congo, 27 in Senegal, and then high on in Kyrgyzstan and Armenia. Divorce registration level in Armenia was 61%. So the spectrum of the countries that we are presenting here already shows a range from very low to very high levels. These two patterns we are observing. First is that where different types of marriages exist and the overall level of marriage registration is low, it seems the existing country laws have a telling influence in the overall level. In the case of Senegal and Congo, it is the non-registration of customary marriages that seems to be driving the very low level. On the other extreme, Armenia and Kyrgyzstan have a common history of being former members of the Soviet Union. I'm wrapping up. And they have a built-in culture of registering of events. That's why we are having the near universal level of coverage. But in both sets of countries, socioeconomic characteristics of individuals, be it education, place of residence in rural or urban areas, or region within the country, they also have, the levels differ according to those different characteristics. 1 minute. So to sum it up, these factors that I'm showing on the screen, not in order of importance, just throwing them in. These are the factors that seem to be driving differentials in terms of whether a marriage or a divorce is registered or not. And then as UNFPA, we are engaging in these issues by participating in forums like this, presenting. We also take part in regional conferences of ministers responsible for civil CRVS and make presentations. And we also have the ongoing advocacy for inclusion of specific questions in the 2020 round of censuses to measure marriage registration levels. And I'm happy to also say that DHS, in the 8th round of DHS, there will be questions on marriage registration, because we, in collaboration with Open Data Watch, we suggested recommended questions, which I will cover in the next and final slide, and ongoing research. And we are hoping that this work going forward will lead to legal reforms where there is need, will lead to improved registration levels, as well as publishing of the results thereof, and raised awareness from the population on the need for registering these events. The two questions that we are recommending, one is that censuses and household surveys should aim to capture information about the type of marriage. Is it customary or civil, religious, based on context? Get as much detail as possible about the type of the marriage. And secondly, get information, direct information, is it registered or not? Or can ask a person, do we have a certificate to prove that your marriage was registered? And lastly, we also recommend that countries should also collect information about age at first marriage. This is a question that is recommended according to the principles and recommendations of census, household and population censuses. But again, in our review of the 2010 round of censuses, we found that less than 30 countries actually asked that information. And we feel it's an important information that can be used to gauge or to understand patterns of child marriage across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandile. Really very interesting presentation on marriage registration. I'm going to ask Niamba actually to give us a little bit of a presentation around sex differential in registration of vital events in NUNA Health Observatory in Burkina Faso. This is a research that Louis carried just a couple of months ago, and Louis, most importantly, is going to address the issue of the perspectives of community and officials in this registration. And Louis, I'm going to ask you to keep it to the 10 minutes. Thank you.
Merci, Irina. Bonsoir à tous.
Thank you, Irina. Good afternoon to all. I would like to once again thank the organizer to have provided me the opportunity to present the result of my research that I carried here at IDRC in 2019 while I was the recipient to a scholarship. My presentation is in the differential in the registration of CRVs. This study was carried out in 2019, and it was carried out in the observatory of NUNA, which is in Burkina Faso. We collected data from the supply and the offer part. And from supply, we took into account marriages, births, marriages, and deaths in 2015. And from the supply, we had contact with health centers, civil registration offices that are in our different administrative structures, and we collected quantitative and qualitative data. What are the results that we obtained? As you can see, we only had access to 37% of births that were registered within the time frame of 2 months, and 41% of those births did not have any document. Some parents thought that the birth certificate that they had were birth certificates, and therefore you only have 8% that had a birth document, but that had not been followed by a registration. of vitals. So as you can see, this amount of 37% is a low number, and we saw that 95% of births were into health centers, and those health centers are only second centers for CRVs. So we did not see a difference between gender as of the obtention of birth certificate. Important factors that play a positive role is the fact that of a residency in a semi-urban area. You have also cultural issues. You have certain ethnic groups that tend to register a birth more than others. And you also have the possession of birth certificates by mothers as a key factors. If most fathers have IDs, that is not often the case for mothers, where there were 60% only had IDs. Unfortunately, to register a birth, the IDs of both parents are required. And we add questions to or researchers to see why is there a lack of birth certificate according to respondents. First of all, it's because there is negligence. Parents might not see the importance of registering a child within the prescribed 2 months. And we did not see if there is a great difference between this attitude of negligence between mothers and fathers. And financial, there was a second issue is a financial reason. A third one is the acquisition duration. This is a factor that was stated by fathers, men. They believe that it required a lot of traveling to the health centers to obtain the document, and and that, of course, played into the distance and also the fact that mothers did not have documents that were required in those areas.
Démontre que quel que soit le sexe que nous prenons, la plupart des naissances sont enregistrées dans le groupe d'âge 10-15 ans. Pourquoi? Parce que tout simplement, c'est dans ce groupe d'âge que les enfants passent leur premier examen scolaire, qui est le certificat d'études primaires. Et pour passer cet examen, les enfants ont besoin d'avoir un document de naissance pour compléter donc les dossiers. Pour l'enregistrement des mariages, nous avons constaté que dans cette zone, il n'y avait que 2% des mariages qui avaient été célébrés à l'état civil. La majorité des mariages étaient de nature religieuse. Et comme on pouvait s'attendre, l'âge moyen au mariage des hommes était nettement plus élevé que l'âge moyen au mariage des femmes. On avait une différence de pratiquement 10 ans. Et on avait constaté que dans l'échantillon des femmes de notre enquête, il y avait pratiquement 20% qui avaient été mariées avant l'âge légal, qui est de 17 ans au Burkina Faso pour les femmes. Et il y avait 12% des hommes qui avaient été mariés avant l'âge légal, qui était donc qui est de 20% pour les hommes. Et comme on l'a dit tantôt, le mariage religieux était le mariage le plus célébré. Et même lorsque on donnait le choix à nos différents enquêtés de choisir entre les différents types de mariages, ils choisissaient volontiers donc le mariage religieux. Ils suggéraient même à la limite que ces mariages puissent être également enregistrés au même titre que le mariage civil qui est célébré devant l'officier d'état civil. Enfin, pour l'enregistrement des décès, on n'avait pratiquement que 3% des décès qui avaient été enregistrés parmi les décès qui ont été notifiés en 2015 dans l'Observatoire de population de.
And there were no differences, major differences between men and women. But there is one thing that we noted here is that the number of women who died in centers for facilities were at a higher rate than those of women, which would lead us to believe that there is more attention given to them, to men, than that of the health of women. For most people, we see that the death was not registered. We saw that there was no differences when it came to men or women, and naturally, that's the reason for that is that why should you register? Well, people ask why should we register this death? We also looked at the after the time period of 2 months in order to registration of a death. The registration of death for men is not necessarily what happens for women. And as you see that here in the graph, now the plausible explanation for this situation is that in this zone, registration is only registered at a certain time, and men are those who determine or have most power, economic power. We see that there are more registrations, death registrations for men. The indicators that I'm talking to you about here are only valid for the study zone and cannot be extrapolated for all parts of Burkina Faso. This is why we suggested that these studies could not necessarily be used in other contexts. With the support of the Excellence Center and other groups, there are other studies that will be conducted in Burkina Faso. We believe that the results of all of these studies will be able to us better to identify strategies in order to improve the strategies and the processes that can be used in Burkina Faso. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Louis.
Thank you very much.
Doghi, actually, to give us a little bit of a presentation around the Roma population in Europe. I think in most of our international conferences and regional meetings, we are talking a lot about unregistered people in, Asia, in Africa, I don't know, in Latin America, but there are also such minorities in Europe, and if we are to achieve the Leave No One Behind agenda, we really have to focus on those minorities as well. So Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Irina. Thank you all the three partners for putting together such an important event. I'm overwhelmed by the multitude of data and situations and information coming from such a diverse group of experts and actors dealing with this issue. My presentation will be a little bit atypical, I guess, for such a forum because most likely the Roma population is known to a lesser extent. So here's my take to give you a hint about the Roma population and the kind of challenges they are facing with regard to civil registration. So who are the Roma people? We are basically Indians. The Roma people left northwest India 1,000 years ago, and then they came to the European continent in different waves and from different places. And throughout their history, they've been migrating quite a lot. On this map, you can see the red wheel. And the bigger the wheel and the greener the color shade, the larger the size of the Roma population. For instance, in Romania, my home country, The official census of the Roma population indicates roughly 600,000 Roma. Unofficially, and by all the other estimates, it goes up to 2 million. So this is maybe very indicative of the problem that Roma are facing with regard to access to civil registration and access to public services. The history of Roma in Europe was one of persecution and oppression and a perpetuation of marginalization, exclusion. And many things have not changed significantly, unfortunately. This year, in Romania, we marked on the 20th of February 164 years since the liberation of Roma from slavery. Roma were slaves there for 500 years. And they were set free without any compensatory measures, any inclusion policies, pretty much nothing. They were also victims in Europe of deportations, internment, and execution and extermination during the Holocaust. Up to 500,000 of Roma people were exterminated during the Second World War. I would like to introduce you, because we speak of data, with the European Union Fundamental Rights Agency MIDI surveys. The MIDI surveys are an instrument to test the situation and to assess the situation of discrimination against various minorities. And one of them is the Roma minority. And their main finding is that Roma have emerged as the group most vulnerable to discrimination and crime. The survey portrays a bleak picture of the estimated 12 million Roma in Europe, out of whom 6 million of them are within the European Union. The survey reveals the extent of discrimination, underreporting, and a sense of resignation, ranging from 60 to up to 100%. Roma, depending on the country of the survey, did not report their most recent experience of discrimination to any competent authority. Also, they did not report because of the lack of confidence in the authorities, in the law enforcement and justice structures. This is the list of countries that were part of the survey. Close to 8,000 households, amounting for roughly 34,000 Roma individuals were surveyed and asked about their experience with exclusion and discrimination. The first EU Fundamental Rights Agency Roma survey indicated a high percentage of exclusion, which means 8 out of 10% of Roma were at risk of poverty, and half of those were living in a house lacking basic amenities. These are shacks and tents that are not at all unfamiliar in many places throughout Europe. And this is showing the extent of risk of poverty. The horizontal dark blue line indicates the mainstream, the majority population at risk of poverty back in 2014. And the light blue indicates the Roma. So you can see the huge discrepancy. In every country, literally, there are hundreds of informal settlements at the fringes of the society, lacking infrastructure, houses not being possessed legally, there is no proper registration. 1 in 4 Roma reports unemployed or self-unemployed. Roma women, obviously, as we've witnessed throughout the world, they bear the brunt of vulnerability. I included some photos portraying Roma. Many of them live in squalor and in shacks and improvised barracks. The kind of challenges are multifold, procedural and legislative aspects. There are the fees, which is an additional burden for people who have socioeconomic problems. Parents need to obtain identification documents before their children can have their birth registered. So it's a sort of a vicious circle. Late registration requires another documented adult as witness. So in such communities, documented adults are few and not necessarily willing to help others. Inability to register due to lacking proper residential status, no registered address. And again, photos portraying the socioeconomic situation. Some Roma lack knowledge of the state language. They cannot understand the instructions and the requirements for registration. There is overall mistrust and reluctance in dealing with authorities, and that's kind of mutual. There is low awareness of the importance and the benefits of registration. And that brings about all sorts of consequences. Limited access to public services, housing, healthcare, education, and social services. And obviously, deriving from that, it's the inability to participate as voters in, and even as candidates in electoral processes or overall in the public life. These are all conditions that are perpetuating and exacerbating distrust towards the state institutions. A number of recommendations, but many of them were already mentioned here, and not only recommendations, but actually the kind of solutions that were already worked out. In the OSCE, we speak OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's an intergovernmental organization formed by 57 participating states, 55 of them in Europe, plus United States and Canada. So I feel like home here in OSCE. With regard to Roma, there are specific commitments, and one of them is, since 2003, the OSCE Action Plan on Improving the Situation of Roma and Sinti, which says very clearly that states have a duty and responsibility to ensure that Roma and Sinti people have all necessary documents, including birth certificates, identity documents, health insurance certificates, and so on. And that the state should work in partnership with civil society. Others have also mentioned the important role of civil society to address these problems. What we've done on this matter, we've produced a baseline study about the situation of civil registration in Ukraine. We organized a series of events, conferences, roundtables, and workshops, bringing together civil society, community representatives, as well as state representatives to discuss the problems and find solutions to them. I'm very happy to mention here our collaboration with the UNHCR on the issue of statelessness. We organized already 3 joint practical seminars, and together with them also twinning study visits between Ukraine government representatives visiting Serbia to learn from their experience in addressing IDPs, and from Georgia and Bosnia, a visit to Bosnia and Herzegovina. Other colleagues in other departments have produced a compendium of good practices in identity management in the OSCE region, which also analyzes the gender dimension of civil registration system and highlights the vulnerabilities of women. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dan. I'm going to give the floor to Claire, actually, to talk about social norms and legal frameworks and how they impact women and children registration. And she's going to give some examples from the Asia and the Pacific region.
Thanks so much, Irina. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Claire Brolin. I'm from the Centre for Policy Futures at the University of Queensland. And I'm going to be presenting to you today on rights-based approaches to CRVS systems strengthening in terms of a death registration project that I'm involved in to enable gender justice. And I'd like to acknowledge my colleague in the room, With me, Gloria Matenge, who is a CRVS advisor at the Pacific Community in SPC. I'd also like to acknowledge my other colleagues in the room from the Pacific region, from the Philippines and from Fiji in particular. As they would be well aware, I in no way speak on or for or behalf of the people of the Pacifics, the region. It's a very diverse and culturally rich community. So a little bit of background about our research project that actually we've just received funding for and we're just moving ahead. It's, as it says on your screen, we're going to look at advancing the SDG CRVS gender agenda in the Pacific in terms of focusing on maternal deaths and deaths of women due to assault and intimate partner violence. It actually took about 12 months to work up this project idea because it was all about developing relationships, and we realised that this was going to be a multidisciplinary research project, an interdisciplinary research project. So we really were very much aware that we needed to get the team right. So the team consists of colleagues in country, and as well as colleagues from the SPC's Statistics Division, Gloria, colleagues from the SPC's gender team that are based in Fiji, as well as I have some academic colleagues at the University of Queensland from 3 different faculties. So a specialist in public health who specialises in gender and stigma and health. Myself, specialising in SDG CRVS rights-based approaches, and another colleague from the Faculty of Law who specialises in law in the Pacific and plural legal systems. So we decided to keep this project, consider it a phase 1 project, keep it small, keep it focused, and do a good job and build on it and use the lessons that we learned from this project to build. So we're only going to focus on one particular country, and we have 2 objectives. One is to examine that country's law and policy with respect to CRVS system strengthening vis-a-vis maternal deaths and deaths of women due to external causes. And then we also want to examine the application of the law and policy and compliance with the law and policy in practice with regard registration of maternal deaths and deaths of women and girls due to external causes. So there's going to be 2 elements to the project. There'll be a desktop review of law and policies, and then more of a qualitative, in-depth fieldwork research component. And we're looking to talk to multi-stakeholders, so civil society, community leaders, faith-based organisations, their leaders. Faith-based organisations play a very prominent role in shaping norms in the Pacific region. And of course, colleagues from government, civil registration, bureaus, etc. So there are a few factors to bear in mind whenever you move forward to undertake research on the topic of death registration and women in the Pacific, and that is to be very cognizant of the fact that we're dealing with a very heterogeneous, diverse, culturally rich region. You know, the Pacific region is equivalent of 15% of the globe's surface. There's 26 Pacific Island countries and territories that spread across 3 regions: Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. So in some small island developing states, we have very small populations. For example, in Nauru, which is a really tiny island in Micronesia, you've just got under 14,000 people. Fiji, on the other hand, has just under 1 million people. PNG, Papua New Guinea, around 8 million people. Australia, 25 million people. So and so we also have to acknowledge that each of these 26 Pacific countries and territories have their own CRVS systems and laws and frameworks and ecosystems and social norms that impact and guide and frame these systems. So we're dealing with CR systems that are very, very context specific. Several countries report achieving more than 90% coverage in birth and death registration, and these include Niue, Palau, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. But many countries and territories are working hard to increase birth and death registration. Obviously, a key issue around complexity of improving birth and death registration comes to geography. We're dealing with countries in a really remote part of the world geographically. Many are island archipelago nations. And there's not necessarily a history and culture of registration. At the same time in the Pacific, we're seeing a big trend towards urbanisation. For several reasons, economic, climate change, but that does not necessarily mean that a culture of registration, civil registration, is necessarily going to exist in urban areas. We also see strong patriarchal systems in the Pacific, role of chieftains, and traditional villages and sub-villages have long been organised around separate gender statuses and roles. And we also have to remember, however, that in my region, it's not just low and middle income countries that face challenges around birth and death registration. In my own country of Australia, and I come from the state of Queensland, we have an under-registration of births when it comes to our Indigenous populations. This particular study that came out in 2018 highlighted that between 8 to 10% of Indigenous births in my state aren't registered, which I find fairly unconscionable. But when we're thinking about social norms and barriers and enablers to birth and death registration, particularly in countries like my own, we really need to be very aware of the fact of the power structures that are infused in the concept and the language of registration. And so therefore we need to make sure that when we undertake civil registration and vital statistics strengthening practices, that they're extremely participatory. So community-based participatory research approaches are engaged, and as well as participatory governance mechanisms and platforms are set up. So the approach that we decided to take within our team toward our project looking at death registration in this particular country in the Pacific is one based on rights-based approaches to CRVS system strengthening. When I wrote this paper, and it was published last year, it was interesting to look at the literature because sadly there's just not a great deal written around rights-based approaches on CRVS. When I think rights-based approaches, particularly when we're talking about the gender agenda and gender justice, are just so foundational and fundamental. And there's been a number of discussions and explanations as to why that is, and for reasons of time, I'm not going to elaborate today. Except, though, to say that, in terms of my colleague Alison, I completely agree with you around the importance of having human rights practitioners involved to ensure that there is robust monitoring of discriminatory practices. We're also big advocates for CRVS systems. And the need to look and utilise data that comes out of those systems and highlight the data gaps to advocate for rights-based issues and challenges that arise in different settings and environments. So one of the things that I highlighted in my particular article is the Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights' 6 rights-based approaches to data. Given both the opportunities and the risks associated with CRVS system strengthening in the SDG context and the 2030 Agenda support for a data revolution more broadly, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2015 issued a guidance note on a human rights-based approach to data. This guidance note draws from internationally agreed principles for statistics and echoes the call for a data revolution for sustainable development that upholds human rights. And I propose in my paper that these 6 principles and this particular framework that has been issued by the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights provides a really excellent template to begin examining how to integrate human rights-based approaches to and in birth, marriage and death registration and certification practices, as well as think about, the acquisition, storage, analysis and dissemination of birth and cause of death death data, for instance, and that very much links to, I think it was Timothy Orrell's comment this morning. These are the 6 rights-based principles and approaches that we should be taking, according to the Office for the High Commission of Human Rights, whenever we're engaged in CRVS system strengthening work. But what we need to remember, and Gloria and I have had a number of discussions about this, is that when we apply these principles to different settings, there's going to be a different set of answers and a different set of questions. So that's something we have to also be very cognizant of. Yes, I've run out of time, but I was just going to explain how I think that the growing support of CRVS system strengthening through the prism of the social ecology model very much marries and reflects the rights-based approach to CRVS system strengthening that we propagate and propose. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, coming to the socio-ecological models. This is something which is actually near and dear to our hearts here at IDRC. And then, because I think CRVS, you know, we are actually a learning program, we as a community of practice. And I think that into our work, we can incorporate a couple of lessons which are learned from other programs, in particular for public health. And I'm thinking here most particularly about 2 programs. One is polio eradication. I think that, you know, in the beginning of the years 2000, we have come as a public health community to the, you know, a stagnation in number of polio cases into the world. And with very innovative approaches, focusing on community participation and the social mobilization, social and behavior change in India, the community of public health workers was able really to go down to elimination of polio in India and replicate the Indian model across the world, both in Africa and in Asia, with a very limited number of cases existing nowadays. And another very important program from which we hope that we can learn something is the female genital mutilation program, the joint program of UNFPA and UNICEF, which is actually leveraging social norms and how we can do social and behavior change at scale. I think this is something which we need to learn as practitioners in CRVS. And Leyla Sharafi is going to share with us some lessons learned from this program and maybe us to collectively reflect how to put them in practice in CRVS as well.
Is it on?
Yep.
There's so many microphones, sorry. Okay, testing all the technology. What's happening? It's going back. Bear with me here. Okay, here we go. So, yes, my name is Leyla, but you also see my colleague Nafissatou Diop's name there. She's the guru of the FGM program with UNICEF and UNFPA. She couldn't be here today to join us, so I'll try to do justice to the great work that's been going on for 13 years, thanks to UNFPA and UNICEF. But the idea here is really to, as Irina said, an example of one programmatic experience where we really can zoom in to look at the social norms approach and how it's been applied to a program that really is meant to promote gender equality, but also see how it can lend experiences and knowledge to how we can improve quality and coverage of CRVS. Okay, I'll keep talking. Just in the meantime, while we get the slides right, so FGM, just as a reminder, is a practice that involves altering or injuring the female genitalia for non-medical reasons, and it is internationally recognized as a human rights violation. It is also within the SDGs under Target 5.3, along with child marriage as a harmful practice. Globally, it's estimated that 200 million girls and women alive today have been cut. It's probably an underestimate. We know that the practice is declining in a majority of countries, but given that in those countries a high rate of population growth is being experienced, we will see more girls that will be cut. A little bit about the joint program. It's in its 13th year, phase 3, UNFPA and UNICEF. It's one of our flagship programs in UNFPA for addressing gender inequality, and one of the great experiences of joint programming within the UN family. It's the largest program to date that works on eliminating the practice, and it works in 17 countries, primarily in Africa, but also the Middle East. More estimates show that more than 3.3 million girls and women have benefited from the program. Over 24 million individuals have been connected through this program, and 9,000 communities have abandoned the practice. 13 countries, as a result of the advocacy around this program, have built legal and policy frameworks, and we see more countries establishing national budget lines to try to address this issue. I'd like to talk a little bit about the social norms science. We know that social norms are unwritten rules governing behavior shared by members of a group or given society. They are informal, often implicit, and they are in contrast sometimes to individually held attitudes and beliefs. And that's a really important tenet in this social norms work. It can dictate how people in a group believe, the things they should believe are typical and appropriate. A social rule of behavior that members of a community follow in a belief and others then follow suit. So you can see here on the slide, they're really about interdependent action. So you can see also there on the right-hand side, a social norm is not only constructed by a person's individual belief, but within a specific reference group. So your reference group, everyone has specific reference groups in your life. It could be your family, it could be your religious group, it could be your community, it could be your coworkers and your colleagues. And so those common social norms that are held within that reference group is really important to identify in this program, in the social norms approach, which I'll talk a little bit about. But the compliance amongst the community and the broader reference groups that you're part of is really important, the compliance element. So you can see here a couple of pictures that we've put in. There's independent action, you rowing a boat on your own, but interdependent action, which is you rowing the boat with your friend or rowing with a team. You have to share common social norms to know what to do next and how to proceed. There are two main tenets of social norm change, two maxims. A social norm is hard to change because an individual's action is interdependent with another's in a reference group, as I said. So you have to really work through all the different sectors of society. And you have to start with boys, girls, parents, traditional leaders, different members of medical personnel within a community. It really has to be a cross-cutting, multi-stakeholder approach. And this is two things, if we take away from this presentation, is enough people must believe that enough people are changing, and seeing is believing. In the case of FGM, several factors make a huge difference, right? Knowledge, attitudes, legislation, economic reasons, although economic reasons have been shown not to have a huge impact on this, sustaining the practice or eliminating the practice, and access to quality services. But I want to draw your attention to the bubble at the what would be your top right, which is social expectations. This is where the maintenance of this practice and what we're trying to change really zooms in on the social expectations. So it's not so much that I believe my daughter should remain uncut, or my mother believes her granddaughter should remain uncut. It's what I think others want and what others will continue to do, and the punishment or the reward system for being a deviant or not. So I think that part is what the program has really tried to focus on. Add another layer of complication. Social norms are embedded within broader cultural models. So it's your identity as a wife. So it's your identity around gender roles and responsibilities. It's your identity as what it means to be a member of a community. So the cultural norms around that. The identity of being a daughter or a woman. So there are all these different web of beliefs and norms that connect back up to a particular norm around coming down to the norm of cutting a girl. So it really is challenging to address all of these norms at the same time. And now we have a blank screen. Okay, so zeroing in on the FGM program. I just want to say from the outset, we're talking here about addressing at the community level the social norms. But the FGM program, of course, works at using the ecological model. So the national level policies, laws, the community level is really what we're focusing on here. So the change process really starts with having a reference group that you find that we call positive deviants. So those that really believe that changing the norm is important. And using that group to have sustained, engaged deliberations with a trained facilitator, using a curriculum that's rights-based, so right to education, right to health, all the different rights to livelihood are the basis of that curriculum. And then you have that group go on to share the information with other members of the community. And it's an organized, what we call an organized discussion. It's an organized diffusion. So that's what the next slide shows you, is that there's a core group, there's sustained evaluative deliberation, so that core group where the community is discussing using the trained facilitator with a rights-based curriculum, and then that group takes on that knowledge, that information to their own community, and then even that community then shares with other communities. This slide's really important because somewhere around phase 2 of the joint program, we realized that maybe we were getting to the point of stop cutting your girls, right? Or the community started to sort of, take on this norm. But what we realized is that we weren't necessarily building the agency of girls or building the agency of the women in the community. So we were kind of perpetuating the gender norms that we wanted to try to avoid, or we wanted this program not only to stop the practice of FGM, but we also wanted to promote gender equality, right? So gender transformative approaches. So what we really had to do was build into the program strong components that focused on building the agency of the girls themselves, building the agencies of the women themselves. So in the beginning of the program, you might have seen male elders in a community that were really the ones that were talking about the importance of abandoning the practice, et cetera. But as time went on, now, if you go back to some of those programs where we've been for a while, you can see women really taking a stand, being very participatory, being really the leaders in kind of this cause, and the girls themselves. And I think this is an important point if we're talking about gender equality, because you can change a social norm without necessarily changing a gender norm. And if we take another point away from this, I think this is really the important thing. You can talk about the importance of not cutting the girl without necessarily talking about the value of a girl and her right to education, her right to livelihood, her right to decision-making and leadership. Okay. The next step, after you have this group of positive deviants, a reference group who are now doing this organized diffusion and sharing the information within the community and other communities, you have to create public moments. Because again, it's not about what that person believes in terms of a norm, it's believing that the rest of the community, your neighbors, other folks that are part of your reference group also believe that that norm should stop. So one of the things that we've used a lot in the FGM program is public declarations. And they're really organized, visible, convenings where you have communities come together and demonstrate publicly and declare that they're not going to practice FGM anymore. This slide, I mean, the pictures are probably way too tiny for you to see, but there are many ways that one can see, not just a public declaration. I don't know if you can see, but there's an image in the middle top of the Salima campaign from Sudan. And this is a program where, this is part of the FGM program, but in Sudan, people started to wear colorful yellow and orange fabrics as a way to demonstrate their support for abandoning the practice. And these visual symbols can be really important in addition to these public declarations as a way to really signify that, others around us, others like me, others like our family really support abandoning this practice. There's another one in the lower corner left-hand side from an initiative in Pakistan using a yellow blanket to promote skin-to-skin contact, so an initiative to promote newborn health. And the yellow blanket really became the symbol of this message or this norm of kind of changing some of the practices around taking care of a newborn. So anyway, there are other, those two pictures in the top are also pictures of public declarations. So it's really not enough to just stop within the community or stop within your particular reference group. You have to really amplify this change. And that's what this slide here talks about, using media, using, for example, in the nomadic community of the Afar region in Ethiopia, using Dagu, which is a traditional way of spreading news, or community radio, or really it's the importance is then to amplify the new norms that have been taken up. Coordinated adoption of a new social norm, that's showing basically what I said. Okay, last slide. Harmonizing social changes with changes in moral and legal regulation. So this is where it gets a little tricky. You have to really look at how social norms then link up to the legislative framework or legal norms, or what another set of norms is moral norms. So your own, let's say, values or belief systems that you've been, socialized with. So it's sometimes that dissonance between these different norms is where it gets a little challenging. Lessons for gender and CRVS. Well, it's basically to say that it has to be people-led, has to be people-centered, have enough of a group that supports CRVS and really try to exploit that with this organized diffusion and social norms approach. But three things I want to say in closing is that anything that we do in terms of the social norms, we have to recognize that it has to be sustained. It takes time. I mean, these discussions that I talked about with the communities, we're talking years. So, it's not easy work. It takes time. It's hard to measure, although there are metrics. It takes a lot of patience, knowledge, deliberate, focused, and explicit attention to things like the gender norms, which we weren't necessarily paying attention to that I talked about. It has to be sustained over time and show, you have to show who supports what and then really amplify that. So I'll stop there. And then lastly, working with the civil society and women's movement, which of course other colleagues have also said. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leyla. Such a rich learning from the female genital cutting program joined with UNICEF. I'm going to address to each of you a question maybe, and I'm going to ask you really to keep it to the time and give your answer in like 1 minute, like 90 seconds, so that our distinguished audience here has time to ask you some questions, because I'm sure there are going to be some. So I'm going to start by Louis. Louis, the research you presented actually has been pioneering in more than a way. Can you elaborate a little bit more with regards to the knowledge, attitudes, and practices of the population with regards to registration of vital events?
Merci, Irina, pour cette question.
Thank you for this question. It's true that my research has shown that the knowledge, practices, and attitudes are very important parameters that we must take into account when we wish to improve the situation. Even if we put all the infrastructure into place that could be used and all the staff that could be used, as long as knowledge is not improved and attitudes towards practices aren't changed, it will be very difficult to change this lack of registration access. So you must sensitize the population. Our study showed that for birth registration, birth registration should happen, but only 37% used the instruments because they failed to understand the instruments 2 months after birth, or they do not know that it exists. In Burkina Faso tests, where women had to register children, many women did not prevail themselves of that right. They believed that that was a man's job. So if you want identity documents, ID documents, well, then you have to wait for the man to do that because that's their job. Also, for young mothers have difficulty registering births. If the father's identification is not known. For marriage registration, even when we asked people to choose the different types of marriage, they would always choose religious marriage because they did not understand the importance of the marriage registration for the civil level. They didn't realize that it's important to have the documents so that they can have their rights respective should their spouse die. They prefer the religious aspects. And regarding death certificates, most people that we spoke to, only 7%, in fact, knew that they should be registered. And among the 7%, only 3% of deaths were registered. So we saw that it was mainly men's deaths that were registered. And that is understood because people only register deaths for inheritance reasons. And since men have most of the economic power, then you can understand that men's deaths would be more likely to be registered. Thank you very much. Leyla?
Major success. It's a program which works on changing social norms and leveraging actually positive behaviors. So we know that people are highly emotional and they are influenced by their environment, by the people who matter to them, and by others, the ones whom they are interacting with. So practically what is happening around a person and the context matters as much as what the person thinks itself. So what do you think would be the major recommendation you'd have for the CRVS programs in terms of social norms approach?
Well, I think, as I said, you really have to, it sounds like we've said this, but it's important to reiterate that working with the community so that they can define how CRVS matters or doesn't matter to them. Working with civil society, if we're talking about women and girls, particularly those most left behind, it's working with the women's movement and really putting them at the center. It may not always be, it may be messy, it may not be exactly the direction that you might imagine as, let's say, a program manager or someone who's setting up an intervention, but it's really critical that you put people at the center, and that's what we've defined or experienced from the FGM program has shown, that everything from the identification of those positive deviants or those who actually supported the abandonment of the FGM practice, it's the community that decides who is part of this reference group, and then from there the key messages, and of course always with a rights-based lens, as Claire talked about. I think this is also really critical, but I would say be ready for sustained investment. Be ready to engage the community and put them at the center. Be ready to work with the women's movement truly hand in hand, and rights-based, all those principles that Claire talked about.
Thank you so much. Claire, so thank you very much for your presentation. How can we ensure actually that these legal barriers are identified, and then some of the legal disposition are actually gender sensitive, and we are ensuring as such universal coverage, in particular also for female?
Yeah, thanks. Great question, Irina. I think the issue that has been very much underappreciated in the CRVS system strengthening world, both theoretically and empirically when it comes to women and human rights and gender justice, is the impact that plural legal systems play on shaping behaviours. And the bidirectional relationship between plural legal systems and social norms. So plural legal systems are the systems that operate in the world. So they're the de facto law. So we have laws on paper. So they're our de jure laws. So we'll have a state that says, no, we don't discriminate. It's in our law. We have gender equality and gender parity. It's in our law. But the reality is something that's very, very different. And women and human rights lawyers and practitioners have known for decades that one of the key challenges in advancing women's rights and girls' rights around the globe is the problematics that arise with respect to the power of plural legal systems, of customary laws, of tribal laws in dictating and shaping the behaviours of women. So I think moving forward, we need to look at the law as it stands in the de jure law. What do our legal statutes say around CRVS system strengthening? And yes, looking at them through a gender rights lens, but also qualitatively, ethnographically, really looking at how are these plural legal systems impacting on the ability of women to register births, marriages and deaths, or have their births, marriages and deaths registered.
Thank you so much, Claire. Dan, I'm going to come back to you. So 12 million people, Roma in Europe. How do you think that the cultural biases, the tradition and the history of Roma in the 20th century are impacting their own decision to register these vital events?
Thank you, Irina. Contrary to the general belief for those that know something about Roma, is that Roma are nomad and traditional and itinerant. That's no longer the case for centuries. An overwhelming majority of Roma are settled, are sedentary, are to various extents assimilated, so to speak. There are still some very traditional communities that are traveling within the country in particular, but those are really, really a minority. And within such very traditional communities, you can still see a number of practices. Sometimes, and especially from outside the community, people tend to say, oh, it's their culture, it's their tradition. Yeah? But actually, there are some practices, and that connects also to some other harmful practices. Yeah? It leads to a less severe, but nevertheless harmful practice than female genital mutilation, which is a practice in some Roma communities of early marriage, of arranged or forced marriage. And obviously, the biggest problem here is with the very young girls, the young Roma girls. So there are such practices, although this is really exceptional as compared to the whole Roma population. Connected to that, there is also the humiliating so-called virginity testing. It's a taboo issue, and it's not challenged in the Roma community, or it's not challenged enough. And it's about time that there is a stronger message coming from all directions, also from outside the Roma community and from within the Roma community, that such practices must be eradicated. But actually, if we speak of the history in the society, I think here it's the opposite. A majority of the mainstream population that lives somehow in areas where there are Roma communities and so on, they harbor a prejudiced mentality towards Roma, and that has been perpetuated for centuries, and it seems like a never-ending loop. With all in the past 2 decades or so, there were all sorts of initiatives, and including development of governmental strategies for Roma integration, of Roma inclusion. And on paper, as you've mentioned, Claire, on paper, many things are nice and good. And if they would be implemented, even a third of them, you would already see a significant improvement in the situation of Roma. But you don't see it because the real problem is here. It's the bias, it's the prejudice, it's the racism. And if you don't address that, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at a problem, it's going to be thrown into a black hole. And if I may have 1 more minute of a very important situation that connects as a reaction to something that other colleagues have said previously, as how laws and procedures and policies are actually used or abused to prevent a a fulfillment of a proper civil registration or residency status or even citizenship for many people. Roma are also victim of such situations. In Europe, especially those from former Yugoslavia who fled the country during the conflict and went to Western Europe in many countries. And after a decade or two, actually, they were forcibly deported back to various countries in the Western Balkans. Now, because I'm here now in Canada and close by, it's also United States, in the past 2 decades or so, many Roma are coming from Europe here, and they were asking for refugee status for reasons related to racism or harassment or gross violations of human rights. And one such case, very recent one, is of a Roma individual on her name, Roxana Hairizi, and her family, who have lived here for more than 2 decades, and they are right now very, very close to be deported. Many other Roma families were already deported in the past, and other new ones who are here will be in the same risk. Now, our problem is that the laws and policies are actually used to curtail one's right to pursue happiness, to live in a place where they feel safe and secure, and to live a life in dignity. I think especially for those who have built their life and future in those countries for so long, they must be given the right to stay.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Sandile, I know you are a colleague of very few words, so but very meaningful nevertheless. So I'm going to ask you, could you give us some, recommendations or some ideas about how can we concretely, what are the concrete steps on improving marriage coverage at country level into the next decade, which is the decade of delivery and action?
Thank you, Irina. I think the starting step would be understanding exactly where we are in terms of the coverage. The existing situation is, as I indicated in the presentation, we don't really know where we are in terms of marriage registration. So we need first to generate the data to be able to assess the coverage and then the quality of the data therein. And then once we have that information, we will identify gaps, whether is it on the supply side or the demand side of registration. And then based on that know-how, we can craft strategies to address. If, like in the example of the countries that we presented today, it's clear that in some countries, just by reviewing the existing national laws governing family code, there can be a change in the marriage registration level. And in other contexts, you may find that, like other speakers indicated, the population itself, the people themselves, are not very much aware of the benefits of registration. So we need that information to be able to craft necessary interventions to increase the coverage.
Thank you so much, Sandile. I'm going to open the floor for questions very briefly. So the microphones are in the room. The 2 microphones are in the room for those, before I will quickly conclude this very interesting and, thought-provoking panel.
Hello. I have a question about the intergenerational transmission of lack of documentation. I've noticed in Burkina Faso, there was the mother lacking a birth certificate, and that is determinant of being able to register the child. But I imagine in the Roma community as well, where mothers are undocumented. And so we see this over and over again. And my question is about how to break that cycle. And do we make a child protection argument to try to intervene and get documents for the child? Do we do the mother-child dyad? is this something that we're talking about, and what solutions are on the table to break that cycle?
Go ahead.
Congratulations to all the presenters that actually gave us stellar presentations. I would like to ask a question to Mr. Joly and Mrs. Leyla to underscore that there is a difference between the semi-urban environment compared to the rural one, to see the difference in accessing registration. Did you further your studies to see if there is any government take on that? And also, did you ask about the administrative state of the parents themselves? Do these parents declare the number of children, all the children? Ms. Leyla, I want to ask you here, is there also a system of surveillance and control and follow-up? Does that exist, or maybe there is not such a thing in these cases when children are declared? Thank you. Hi.
Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. Thanks very much for a really fascinating panel and a great day. I come from a community that's looking at data for development across the SDGs, so not just civil registration. And one of the things we seek to do across a very broad partnership is to bring together different data sources to address some of the challenges. One of the areas that's really growing, that we see a lot of activity around, is what's called citizen-generated data, which is a very broad category of different methods and approaches that are sort of united around the agency of individuals and community members in structuring, producing, analyzing, and using data from the community for to better their own lives. By analogy, I'm wondering if your analysis of the social norm challenges around civil registration might be, whether there may be possibilities, and whether your organizations or others in the room have considered methods to engage community groups in sort of very localized, culturally appropriate registration methods or approaches that could be integrated into national systems in a way that are sort of certified to some extent, in the same way you sort of deputize a health center or what have you, but that could be variable and appropriate to the community. So I guess what I'm wondering is, in addition to trying to take the approach of the Female Genital Mutilation Project and changing the social norms around registration, is in fact go from the community and say, what would be an appropriate way to register in this community, and how could we adopt methods that can be integrated with the formal system to increase coverage. And I'm wondering if anyone has thoughts on the panel or others in the room from those approaches. Thanks.
Thank you. Commencer avec toi.
We will start with you. Would you want to answer the questions? I thank you very much for these very pertinent questions. We have analyzed according to residency, be it rural, semi-rural, urban, semi-urban. And I should state that we did not see a lot of difference, for example, as far as the level of literacy. And this is about those in our sampling. But we saw that there is a correlation between literacy and residents. Those who are in semi-urban environment have a higher level of literacy than those who are in a total rural setting. So you could have a correlation there between literacy and the registration of children. And then we ask, who are these parents that do register their children? These are those who are deemed married by the authorities, those who went and celebrated their civil union. And there we found a correlation between this official marriage and the following births that were registered.
Yeah, I mean, what I understood was after the public declarations and after this sort of, enough people recognize or make a sort of symbolic, whether it's through, a campaign like Salima, where there's use of particular fabric and clothing, or these public declarations. After the fact, there really has to be, sustaining this commitment in all the different country program sites. There have been surveillance or sort of monitoring processes that have been put in place, including in Djibouti, where there's actually community surveillance process that was put in place to look at whether the norms really stuck, because there is a risk that you could slide back to the social norms that were held before. But of course, if it's really community-owned, driven, putting girls and women in the driver's seat, then you have more of a potential for it to be sustained. But yes, there certainly is the science of measuring whether your work is having an impact, particularly, for example, in the case of FGM around social norms. We face a particular challenge around measurement because typically we get the data from DHS and mix, which shows a lag in time in terms of the practice. So there are very specialized surveys that will try to use social norms metrics, including the GEM scale, which is measuring gender norms, as a way to see if these things are changing. Of course, one is, are the girls being cut or not, but also, what does the community feel in terms of the gender norms that I talked about? So there really is an important part that follows what I talked about, which is the working with the reference group, the diffusion, the public declarations, the amplification, and then the very important part of monitoring what this change process has initiated, whether that's happening or not. So it's an important part of it that I didn't go much into, but it's definitely there.
Thank you very much, Leyla. Claire and Dan, can I ask you to 30-second briefly touch on the issue of the intergenerational cost of registration?
The intergenerational cost of registration?
Alison's question. Which, of course, we can also, go into deeper details after, but just like very briefly, if you'd like to respond on that, if you feel comfortable, and Dan as well.
Sure. I mean, I look at, my specialization is in death registration. So I look at the importance of death registration to break intergenerational cycles of poverty relating to inability to access land and bank accounts and funding, particularly for women and girls. So that is where I see the power of death and importance of death registration and death certification. And so I really can't speak so much to the birth registration side. Maybe there's colleagues on the panel who'd be better equipped to speak to that.
It's related to the question of Alison, yeah? No doubt we have this situation concerning Roma. And there were some studies made by UNDP with a dependency trap and so on. I think we have to put the Roma population in the context of Europe and European Union, where the issue is not so much anymore about not knowing how to address the problem. And actually, we've also heard in this global forum how many nice and good ideas, and not only ideas, but also the gentleman in the morning mentioned about one such example, what 80 million were put forward to address this issue. With regard to Roma, we speak of an issue of prejudice, of rejection. It's an attitude of rejection. Roma are still called to go back to India. You know, they are never considered like organically being part of the societies in which they live. So this is the biggest barrier here. Obviously, we speak of a population which is largely uneducated. So their understanding of the importance and benefits of being registered as a prerequisite to exercise other rights and so on is at a low level. But with awareness raising and information campaigns, as our colleague fellow mentioned here, for other communities, this issue can be addressed. It's not an issue. And with regard to gathering data, it is important. Open Society produced a report with a focus on Roma about the availability of data or the lack of it. And the report was called No Data, No Progress. I mean, if you don't know the scale of the problem, it means you don't have a problem. You don't think about how to resolve the problem, and you definitely don't allocate the resources for that. So everything with Roma is revolving around, I would say, political will. And I think the gentleman back there, the head of IDRC, had a sort of a rhetorical question. When we speak of civil registration, do we speak of lack of knowledge or we speak of lack of political will? What is needed most? And I think in most of the cases, it's the lack of political will. And with regard to Roma, let's not forget that the very data that was gathered, and it was gathered in the past about them, it was used to identify them, to gather them, to deport them, and has led to the extermination of a large number of Roma. So it's very sensitive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I ask you, Sandile, to conclude on the Janus questions on data, maybe?
Okay. Thank you again, Irina. This is my personal view. I am in support of the idea of encouraging citizen-generated data. And if we place it in the context of what Claire presented as principles of rights-based approach to data generation, one is participation, transparency, secondly, privacy, thirdly, ensuring accountability and self-identification. I think if we bring all these elements together, they are very much amenable to, if lack of a better word, I would say, a democratization of data generation. So yes, we should encourage it within the framework of a rights-based approach.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid I have to close so that you can go for your break and socialize a little bit. But if I were to conclude, I'd say that all of us want to belong. We do belong to a community, so this community is regulated by norms. With regards to CRVS, I mean, we all know our norms with regards to birth naming, to marriage, in terms of acts or processes, to deaths, what are the ceremonies, but we do not really relate them, what's in there for civil registration. How do we convince the communities? So I think that there is an entire piece of work which we need to do as a civil registration community of practice in terms of understanding the community. You know, consulting them, putting them at the core of the civil registration system, using a little bit of more human-centered approach to system strengthening. So it's not only about information and consultation with the people, it's also about changing knowledges, attitudes, and behaviors, which could lead to more empowerment and participation. So actually people are they are empowered to participate, and they have the authority actually to act and go towards the services to obtain these documents, which are vital for most of them, which establish, and end the legal identity from birth to death, going through other life events. Thank you so much to all of you. It's been really a privilege to have you on my panel.